This morning, we are starting a new series that I originally titled The Benevolent Barrier, but Daniel said he couldn't pronounce the word benevolent, so I changed it to The Merciful Wall. Same idea, and I'll unpack that in the weeks to come. But this morning, it's going to be a series on the most famous sermon ever preached, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. One of my favorite portions of the entire Bible. There's a lot of misunderstanding regarding what's actually happening in the Sermon on the Mount. And a number of years ago, I think 11 or 12 years ago now, I was sort of awakened to what this sermon is really about, and it was remarkably freeing to me. And so I'm looking forward to walking through this with you. I want to begin by reading Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, I'm just going to read the first two verses. So as I mentioned, the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5, 6, and 7. So the first two verses of Matthew 5, I want to read to get us started. One day, as he, Jesus, saw the crowds gathering, Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them. That's it. First two verses sets up the entire context for what he's about to say over the next three chapters. I was in Jackson, Mississippi last weekend. Thank you to my wife for filling in so ably last Sunday morning. But I was in Jackson, Mississippi, and I had been invited there to speak at a men's retreat of a church. And so I spoke on Friday night and a couple times on Saturday, spent time with about 150 guys. And then on Sunday morning, the church that organized the men's retreat, I preached at their two morning services. And when I was preparing some things on Saturday afternoon, I got a text from Stacy. She was preparing for her sermon, and she was doing some research. And she sent me this quote that I found to be stunning, almost perfect. Comes from a psychologist named Patricia Deegan, who is, for the most part, I did some research on her. She's, for the most part, known for her advocacy for mental health because at 17 years old, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Brilliant, brilliant woman. And she said this, a quote that Stacy sent me. Recovery does not refer to an end product or result. In fact, our recovery is marked by an ever-deepening acceptance of our limitations. That may be the best definition of recovery I've ever read. In fact, I would go so far as to say that may be the best definition of life that I've ever read. Recovery is marked by an ever-deepening acceptance of our limitations. I've discovered that there is a lot of freedom in coming to terms with my own limitations, with my own deficiencies. Coming face to face with my own weaknesses is actually and ironically very liberating. It has been for me. Because it's when I arrive at the end of my own resources that I arrive at the beginning of God's resources for me. And that's where freedom is found. Freedom is not found in me trying to make it through life on my own, muscle my way through the difficult things in life. That's not where freedom is found. In fact, that's where a lot of burdens are accumulated. Freedom is found when we finally come to terms with our own limitations, when we finally get to the end of our resources, because it's when we get to the end of our resources that we arrive at the beginning of God's resources for us. I have, as I mentioned, been working for the last almost year now on a book. I had, in my former life, written a number of books, but I haven't written one in 7 years, 8 years now. And this one's very specific. It's unlike any other book I've written. It's a book about the last 7 years of my life. It's a memoir. And it has forced me to revisit and relive some of the hardest, darkest moments of my life. It's been a profoundly emotional experience. I have found myself, I told Stacy last night, I've told her this a handful of times, but I told her again last night, I find myself at surprising moments, just sort of bursting into tears as I work through this material, as I work through the caverns in my own heart in what I experienced over the last 8 years. And this has been not just emotional and hard, but it's been incredibly healing. It's been so therapeutic for me. Surprisingly so. I didn't expect that when I set out to write this book. But having to relive my hardest moments and my deepest desperations has been an exercise for me in an ever-deepening acceptance of my limitations. I have grown in my awareness of my own deficiencies, and I have been able to trace God's faithfulness and God's goodness, things we've already sung about this morning. God's faithfulness and God's goodness in the face of my unfaithfulness, in the face of my badness. It's been hard to come to terms once again with my own failures back then, but then to see God's faithfulness in the face of my failures has been incredibly liberating, incredibly freeing. It has refocused my attention to where my attention ought to be, which is on God's strength, not mine, God's faithfulness, not mine. I say this, and this is what I would consider, at least now, because the book isn't finished, but what I would consider at least now the most gripping part of the book. I say this, in her book, Amazing Grace, Kathleen Norris reflects on something Friar Martin Smith, an Anglican monk, wrote. He wrote, "Ambivalence is a sacred emotion." Smith said that he finds, quote, "a widespread need in contemporary spirituality to find ways of praying and engaging with God, ourselves, and one another that have room for simultaneous contradictions, the experience of opposite emotions. We need," he goes on to say, "to find the sacredness in living the tensions." That perfectly articulates what I was going through at the time, ambivalence. In the wake of my self-implosion, I was living in a combustible dust of consequences. I was scared, ashamed, angry, hurt, embarrassed, and confused. I was walking in circles, backwards. I didn't know who I was or where I was. I couldn't make sense of what I had done, who I had become, and who others had become as well. I felt like a stranger to myself and to those I knew. I didn't know what to do next. I felt everything and nothing at the same time. I wish anyone would have said something like, "Tullian, this ambivalence, man, it's sacred. It may not feel like it, but it is. Trust it as such." But there was no one saying that to me. So let me say that to you now. If you're in such a season of life where you're nothing but a bundle of contradictions, that's sacred. In other words, God is right there. Which on a mental level, some of us would say, okay, sure, but at the gut level, rarely feels that way. Stick with that is something Paul Zoll would say to me each time I would feverishly pour out my fear and sadness, my hopelessness, heartbreak, confusion, and rage. His point was that there is a lot to see of God in the middle of all our raw sewage. So don't be too quick to look for an exit. Stick with it, because ambivalence is a sacred emotion. Ambivalence as a sacred emotion is something you would expect an Anglican monk to say. My take on it would be, it's okay to be confused and stuck. And was I ever? I did come across a phrase in French which means between dog and wolf. It describes that time of day when the light makes it difficult to distinguish between a dog and a wolf, friend and foe, known and unknown. In a figurative sense of that time, we can't always know if we're safe or threatened. We feel our eyes deceive us, and we question everything we think we know. In the weeks and months that followed, I spent all my time sacredly ambivalent, confused, exiled, breached between the dog and the wolf. I say breach because something was trying to be born there. I didn't know that then and would have bristled at the thought, but looking back now, I can see it, feel it. Something was struggling to be born in that ambivalent season, something I now name freedom. Now, let me give you, it's a lot of words, but let me give you the backstory as to why that section is so important to me. The guy who's helping me with this book has helped me articulate. He's pulled things out of me that are there, but I've had a hard time articulating. And this so perfectly articulates the fact that I felt stuck stuck in the middle of my own deficiencies, stuck in the middle of my own limitations, stuck in the middle of my own inability to get unstuck. And I wanted so bad to get unstuck. I wanted so bad to get beyond where I was. And yet God, for whatever reason, was just, and Paul's all thankfully at the time, was just sort of stick with that. There is stuff in the middle of all this mess, in the middle of all your weaknesses, in the middle of all your deficiencies and limitations, in the middle of your guilt and shame and regret and loss. There's so much to learn about God. There's so much to see of God. We tend to think that God is seen best when the lights are on. In reality, it's when all the lights are off that we see the light of the world in a way that we've never seen him before. And so just stick with that. I think we make a God out of solutions. I think we idolize things like fixedness and betterment and progress and getting beyond bad places. We make that the goal of life. But what if real growth and progress were a deepening awareness of our own need for God's help? What if that's what growth was? What if growth is not so much a matter of moving beyond where you are, but seeing God right where you are? What if God's main mission in your life isn't to make you better, however we define that, but to make you free? I've pointed this out on a number of occasions here, but in Philippians chapter 3, another favorite part of the Bible for me, the Apostle Paul is describing his life before he met God and then describing his life after he met God. And he describes his life as being at the top of the totem pole religiously. I mean, he describes his own upbringing, his own testimony, his own training, and he says, I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. I kept the law meticulously. He described a flawless religious resume. It says, and then I met Jesus. And all of that stuff became totally unimportant. It became worthless in comparison to knowing Jesus. Now, the reason I bring that up is because oftentimes when we think of spiritual growth, we think of spiritual growth as going from low to high. That we start off bad and we end up good. We start off in a bad spot and we end up in a good spot. Okay, that's spiritual growth. It's like an ascending ladder. But the way Paul describes spiritual growth is the exact opposite. He starts off high. I'm good. I keep the rules. I cross my T's and I dot my I's. I have done everything required of me as a religious person. And then he says, over the course of his life, God systematically deconstructed him so that he gets to the end of his life and he says things like, I'm the worst guy that I know. I'm the chief of sinners. I'm the least of all the saints. I've shared this with you before. My friend Jean LaRue says, if you don't, how does he say it? If you're not the worst person you don't know yourself very well, okay? So true. That's what Paul came to realize. He came to realize that I thought I was good. So in spiritual growth, in Paul's case, and I think it sets a pattern for all of our cases, is that we start off thinking that we're strong, we're self-sufficient, we're good, we can make it on our own. We're told by our parents, perhaps, by the world around us. We're even told by our own deceived hearts that we can make it on our own, that we can do it. And over the course of our life, God systematically shows us that we can't make it on our own. That's really the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount. The whole purpose, the whole mission of the Sermon on the Mount is to expose for us our own limitations and deficiencies, our own inability to make it on our own, especially our own inability to impress God on our own or to gain God's favor on our own. So over the next 8 weeks, beginning today, we'll look at sections from this famous sermon and see how life isn't so much about overcoming as it is about being overcome by the one who promises to never leave us, to never forsake us, to the one who loves us no matter what. So let me just kind of tell you what this sermon is, okay? This is a sermon that Jesus preached, and it's his sermon on the 10 Commandments. This is Jesus' sermon on the Ten Commandments. It's an explanation and application of the long arm of God's law. That's what this sermon's about. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus wants to set us free by showing us our need for a goodness and our need for a rightness that we can never attain on our own, ever. He wants to set us free by showing us an impossible righteousness that is always out of our reach. Always out of our reach. The purpose of the Sermon on the Mount is to demolish all notions that even on our best day we can meet God's requirements. It's about exterminating all attempts at self-sufficiency, at self-sufficient moral endeavor. That's what it's intended to do. So the Sermon on the Mount is not a goal to reach. It's not a ladder to climb, that if we climb higher, we get more of God's blessing, more of God's love, more of God's goodness. No, the Sermon on the Mount is not a goal to reach. It's a merciful wall that we crash into so that we finally cry out, I can't do it. That's what it is. The Sermon on the Mount does us a huge favor by showing us who we really are and what we really need. We can convince ourselves, and we can be convinced by a lot of others that we're bigger than we are, stronger than we are, more like God than we are, more capable than we are. And you've heard me say this before, as empowering as that sounds initially, you try doing that for a while, you try believing that for a while, and you realize how discouraging and how deflating that can be when you bump up against the barriers of life that seem to remind you that you're nothing more than a human being. You know that story, I've said it 1,000 times, one of my favorite Muhammad Ali stories about the time he was flying on an airplane. And the pilot comes on the loudspeaker and says, we're getting ready to experience some pretty heavy turbulence, so will all passengers please be seated and fasten their seatbelts. And the flight attendants are walking up and down the aisle, checking to see the passengers and who had fastened their seatbelts and who hadn't. And one of the flight attendants saw that Muhammad Ali had not fastened his seatbelt, and so she said to him, sir, would you please fasten your seatbelt? And he said back to her in typical Muhammad Ali fashion, Superman don't need no seatbelt. And she responded immediately and said, Superman don't need no airplane either, so please fasten your seatbelt. And I don't know if that actually happened or not, but one of the reasons I love that story is because it's a sobering reminder that none of us are Supermen. We may think we are, we may convince ourselves that we are, but in reality, we're not. All of us are broken down people living in a broken down world with other broken down people. And so the Sermon on the Mount is intended to uncover our helplessness before God, because it's only when we finally admit that we can't make it on our own that we look to the one who did everything for us. Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount to those who thought they were keeping the Ten Commandments. So while it says he gathered his disciples, we now know, as you read on in the Gospels, that there were a lot more people there than just his disciples, and that while he was preaching to his disciples, he was preaching within earshot of the religious leaders, and it's them that he ultimately wanted to hear his sermon. And so he was preaching the Sermon on the Mount to those who thought they were keeping the Ten Commandments, and his goal is to show that God's law is far more demanding than we realize. Far more. The bar is far higher than we think it is. And to think delusionally that we can make it, that we can make the jump, Jesus wants to show we can't. You know, the way that we typically define goodness has to do almost exclusively with what a person does or does not do. So a person who does good things is a good person, and a person who does bad things is a bad person. A good person is one who does the right things and avoids the wrong things. A bad person is one who does the wrong things and avoids the right things. That's typically how we define goodness, which is why Jesus said to the rich young ruler when the rich young ruler approached Jesus and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus' initial response to him is, "Why do you call me good? Only God is good." That seems a bit of an overstatement. only God is good? I mean, I think my wife is pretty good. I think a handful of you people are pretty good. I think I'm even pretty good most of the time. So how in the world could Jesus say, there is no one good but God? Well, the difference is in how God defines goodness and how we define goodness. And we define goodness based almost exclusively on what a person does or does not do. We define goodness almost exclusively on behavior. If a person does the right things and avoids the wrong things, they're good. If a person does the wrong things and avoids the right things, they're bad. Well, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus breaks radically from our definition of goodness. Radically. He cuts through the outer behavior of a person and he looks at what's in the heart. I've shared this before, but you may say, well, that's a relief that God looks at our hearts. I mean, that's a relief that it's good news that Jesus cuts through the outer behavior of a person and looks at what's in the heart. That's a relief that God sees my heart, because regardless of how much I may screw up on the outside, at least God sees my heart. 1 Samuel 16:7 says, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And I remember a time when this verse was a great comfort to me. I thought, thank God that he sees my heart. Thank God that he doesn't evaluate me the way others evaluate me. Others reject me and evaluate me based solely on what they see, but God sees my heart. He sees the real me. He sees behind the curtain of my rough exterior to the softness of my well-intentioned heart. I may not get it right on the outside, but if you can make your way through all of that muckiness on the outside, you finally arrive at a well-intentioned heart. So I found comfort in that verse that says, God doesn't see things the way man sees things. Men evaluate us based on what they see on the outside, but God sees the heart. And then I realized this awful truth as I got older. I have hate in my heart. I have envy in my heart. I have lust and pride and greed and selfishness in my heart. So far from taking comfort in the idea that God saw the inner beauty that no one else could see, I realized that God actually saw the inner ugliness that I was actually able to hide from almost everybody else. And it started making me wish God saw as other people did. It's like, maybe it's not that much of a comfort that God sees the inside. You see, like the rest of you, I'm pretty good at tricking people. I'm good at covering over the worst parts of myself and showing you only the good parts. Unfortunately for us, God sees all that stuff that we work so hard to hide from other people. So God seeing our heart is bad news, not good news. Okay? So when Jesus' mission in the Sermon on the Mount is to cut through the outer behavior of a person and expose what's going on inside. It's supposed to reveal our own need for God, our own need for grace, our own limitations. This is what God's law does. It exposes the heart and not just the imperfection of our behavior. It exposes the imperfection of our hearts, not just the imperfection of our actions. Because if God were only concerned with good behavior, Jesus would have showcased the Pharisees and said, imitate them, follow them, look at them, watch them, do what they do. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. They take God's law seriously. They organize their entire lives around crossing the T's and dotting the I's of God's law. These are serious Christian people. If you want to know what it looks like to be sold out for God, to be fully surrendered to God, that's it. Follow them. He didn't do that. They were the one group of people that he actually called out. What did he say? He said things like, you guys are a bunch of whitewashed tombs. What did he mean? You are super clean on the outside, but you are dead on the inside. He said, you guys are a brood of vipers. He had some harsh words to say about religious people. They were the Pharisees, the religious people in Jesus' day were super successful in doing the right thing, the godly thing. And they thought that's what mattered most to God. But Jesus shows that God's demands extend to what goes on inside of us also. Not just what we do on the outside, but it extends to things like feelings and motivations. Motivations. Our feelings and our motivations must be absolutely pure, not just our actions. So, for example, as we'll see in a couple weeks, Jesus not only condemns adultery, an external action, but also lust, an internal disposition. He not only condemns murder, an external action, but also anger, resentment, unforgiveness, promising the same judgment for both. Now, there are clearly different horizontal consequences between adultery and lust, murder and anger. Obviously, we know that. You don't get thrown in jail for being angry or resentful, but you do for murder. You may not lose your marriage based solely on lust, but you will most likely lose it if one of you commits adultery. So the horizontal consequences are different. But before the court of God, equal judgment for both. And Jesus' point there is to say it's not just about what you do on the outside. It's not just when you focus, and this is where modern Christianity and this Christianity that we read about in the New Testament was so off because it's so myopically focused on what we do, how we behave, the things we avoid, the things we pursue. It's almost exclusively about external action. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine named Samuel this Friday night, and he was telling me about a conversation that he was having with somebody, I don't remember when, recently, a person in church leadership who was sort of asking him some probing questions about whether or not he and his group of friends were on mission together. Were they doing the work of God together? Doing. Now, the moment Samuel said, I'm not even sure what that means, but if it makes you happy to say yes, I guess I'll say yes. The moment Samuel's like, what are you talking about? It's almost like the disposition of the person got a little bit like, well, if you're super serious about God and you're super serious about Christianity and walking out your Christian faith, if you want to be radical, then there's a bunch of things you need to be about, bunch of things you need to be doing, actions you need to be doing. And what's so ironic about that is Jesus almost never focuses on the external behavior of somebody. He always goes straight to the heart, always. Because in some cases, the person who looks really good on the outside has a super hard heart on the inside. That's what matters most to God. And the person who seems to be all jumbled up on the outside has a humiliated and softer heart on the inside, a broken heart on the inside. And so Jesus shows here that the real issue at hand is not what we do and don't do, not that that's unimportant, but the real issue is what's going on inside. God's law doesn't suggest that we simply try hard to get it right on the outside. It demands that we be perfect on the outside and the inside. Now, when you start thinking about it like that, you're like, okay, well, then I'm screwed, okay? I mean, if God's law requires perfection, not improvement, not progress, not I'm better today than I was yesterday, I'm working real hard, and when I compare myself now to the way I used to live 10 years ago, I'm a far better person than I used to be. True as that may be, that's not impressive to God, and that's not what gets in with God. That's not what makes the grade with God. It's perfection that God requires. And when we realize it's perfection that he requires, not just outside perfection, but inside perfection, then we start realizing what God's law is doing. It's exposing me. It's helping me see that I'm not as good, as strong, and put together as I may want to be, or certainly as I want other people to think that I am. There's no wiggle room here. Okay, as we'll see in the weeks to come, there's no wiggle room here. What this requires is the fact that we must always love perfectly, sacrificially, selflessly, not just on the outside, but on the inside too. In other words, you must always want to love perfectly and sacrificially and selflessly. It's not just enough to do it on the outside. You have to want to do it on the inside. So this idea that somehow it's good and righteous to do the right thing even if we don't feel like it. Now, I'm not saying only do the right thing if you feel like it. What I'm saying is when we conclude that doing the right thing on the outside, even when we don't want to on the inside, is impressive to God, all that does is reveal our deep unrighteousness, not our righteousness. It reveals a massive disconnect between what God requires on the outside and what he requires on the inside. It goes on to say, you must never hurt anyone physically, emotionally, relationally, ever, ever, ever. If you've done it one time, you're out. You must always help everyone, always. Physically, emotionally, relationally. You must never harbor grudges, never. You must never seek retribution, ever. In fact, you must never even want to seek retribution. Even if you want to seek retribution and you don't, you discipline yourself not to do it. I'm not going to do it. I want to do it, but I'm not going to do it. That doesn't count because you have to want to do it too. That's the heart of the matter. You must never withhold forgiveness from anyone who wrongs you. Never. In fact, you must never even want to withhold forgiveness from anyone who wrongs you. Ever. When someone cheats you, instead of trying to get your stuff or your money back, you have to give them more. You have to turn the other cheek to your most aggressive enemies. And you must do these things because you want to do them. Want to. Not because you have to do them. Your love for others must be perfectly selfless, or you must be perfect as God himself is perfect. Do you realize how silly it is to think that this book here, this sort of divine self-help manual, is the way we typically treat it, is intended to, let me put it this way. We tend to assume that because the Bible tells us to do something, that it implies we therefore have the capacity to do it. Rather than, every time we find an instruction in the Bible about what to do, a demand that God makes, a requirement of his, the first thing that should do is expose the fact that on our own, we're lost. We can't do this. It's a merciful wall. God's law is a merciful wall that we crash into so that we finally admit, I need help. I need grace. I can't make it on my own. I need God. Only when we see that God's law is inflexible, will we see that God's grace is indispensable. Indispensable. Ultimately, in other words, God's law is a mirror. It shows us who we really are. It shows us what we really need. And it shows us ultimately who Jesus really is for us and what he's done on our behalf. Now, the good news of this sermon comes in chapter 5, verse 17, which we'll get to in a couple weeks, where Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. That was the charge against Jesus. Every religious leader in Jesus' day thought he was soft on God's law. You know, he was being too soft on sinners. You know, God's law is demanding. It requires perfection. It requires holy living. And Jesus was befriending and embracing the riffraff of society. And therefore, they concluded that Jesus is soft on God's law. Jesus must be an imposter. He can't be who he says he is, they thought, because no self-respecting man of God would ever embrace this kind of filth, ever. And so Jesus says, you actually got me all wrong. You think I've come to sort of sweep the law under the rug, say, it doesn't really matter. I mean, God was, my Father in heaven. He was a little excited when he was creating the Ten Commandments. He doesn't really take it that seriously. You can flub up here and flub up there, and he'll turn a blind eye. It's okay. That's what they thought he was saying. But That's not what he was saying when he said, I haven't come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill it. He's saying, I've come to do what no one on earth can do. The lawmaker, as you've heard me say, the lawmaker became the lawkeeper and died for us, the lawbreakers. So because of Jesus, our anger, our murder, our lust, our adultery, our lies, our hatred, etc., are forgiven. And while you may remember your sins, God does not. That your sin is cast into the sea of God's forgotten memory. I have reminders of that tattooed on both arms because I need that. Well, may the accuser roar of sins that I have done. I know them well, and thousands more. My God, he knoweth none. He takes all of our sin, casts them into the deepest parts of the ocean, and like Corrie ten Boom said, puts up a no fishing allowed sign, which, rarely prevents other Christians from putting on scuba gear and going digging, okay? I love that stuff. I mentioned a couple weeks ago, my friend Nadia says that our drug of choice these days seems to be knowing who we are better than. Well, the Sermon on the Mount snuffs out that impulse. Because if we read it for ourselves and we take the demands as seriously as the sermon wants us to take them, we realize we're really not better than anybody else. We find ourselves saying, like the Apostle Paul, I'm the chief of sinners. I am. Real freedom happens when the gift of perfection outvolumes the demand for perfection. The gift of perfection. Whose perfection? Jesus' perfection. That's the gospel. The gospel is that everything Jesus did, all that he was able to accomplish, is now deposited into our account. It's ours. He's deposited $100 million into our account. We can never, ever, ever, even if we continue to spend irresponsibly, which we do until the day we die, we can never outspend Christ's deposit, ever, ever. So real freedom happens when the gift of perfection outvolumes the demand for perfection. When you're finally free enough to admit that you can't please a perfect God, you'll be free enough to rest in the one who is perfect for you. Perfect for you. I've said before that the two words, in my opinion, that probably define the gospel best is for you. Substitution. Something done on your behalf for you that you had nothing to do with. Martin Luther was asked one time, what do you bring to the equation of your salvation? And he said, sin and resistance. Or, I think it was Archbishop William Temple who said that the only thing we contribute to our salvation is the sin that makes our salvation necessary. That's it. That's what we bring to the table. We bring a mess that requires cleanup to the table. And the good news of the gospel is the great divine cleaner has come. He's cleaned up our mess, and as a result of what he has done for us, we are now in with God forever, forever. You could put it this way. Jesus fulfilled all of God's perfect conditions so that our relationship to God could be perfectly unconditional. I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So rest assured, before God, and we'll unpack this over the next weeks, but rest assured that before God, the perfection of Jesus is all you need. The perfection of Jesus is all we have. Let's pray together.